Okay, welcome to the second lesson in chapter 3. Now, the second lesson and the third lesson are talking about two slightly different topics. One is the features of agriculture, which is this video, and the next one is going to be talking about the problems of the Indian agricultural system. But in all honesty, these two are basically the same because the features themselves appear to be problems. So let's take a look at these 8 features. The first one is low productivity, next is disguised unemployment, followed by dependence on rainfall, then subsistence farming, traditional inputs, small holdings, landlord tenant conflict, and backward technology. Now, without even explaining these, you can see all of these basically are negative. So, this is why I think there's a little bit of confusion about which of these is a feature and which of these is a problem. So, we're going to discuss them all in general, and I don't think you need to discern which is a feature and which is a problem, but rather, I want you to have a clear understanding of what the circumstances are in the agricultural industry. First, let's take a look at low productivity. Now, we're going to break this up into 3 different discussion points. The first one is the productivity of rice. Next is the level of wheat production. And then finally, coarse grains. So if we look at this rice graph on the left-hand side of this slide here, we notice that China has a production of 6.7 tons per hectare, whereas the United States is 7.5, the world average is 4.3, and India is below the world average at 3.2. Next, if we move on to wheat, we see the exact same phenomenon. This time, China is way ahead of the rest of the world at 4.7. The United States is slightly above the world average, and India is slightly below the world average. Then, moving on to coarse grains, we notice that both the United States and China have significant levels of production. The world average is about 1/3 of that of China and the United States. The world average is about 1/3 of that of the United States and China, and India is yet another 1/3 of the world average. So all of these are quite dismal results considering that India's rural population is vast and its ability to produce far more than it does is actually physically possible. But because of a variety of reasons, which we'll cover in this section and the next, we'll see that's. And finally, coarse grains. China and the United States are both producing 9 tons per hectare. The world average is 3.5 tons per hectare, and the Indian production is only 1.5 tons per hectare. So, as you can clearly see, the level of rice production, wheat production, and coarse grain production is not only behind the leaders, China and the United States, but it's also behind the world average in all 3 of these. That's quite disappointing when you consider just how much arable land there is in India. Next, let's move on to disguised unemployment. Now, the textbook describes this in a kind of confusing way, so I'm going to give you a realistic example for you to be able to understand this more clearly. If we have a given classroom, let's say the classroom you're sitting in right now, in that classroom, if we wanted to clean that classroom, we'd probably only need 2, at most 3 people to clean it. One person to wipe up the area around the whiteboard and make sure there were no marker fillings left around the ground and sweep up that area. One to clean the glass behind the classroom, and then somebody to sweep up the floors and maybe put the desks and chairs in order. That's it. But disguised unemployment would be if 7 or 8 people were actually hired to clean that classroom. There would be 3 or 4 people who'd kind of be doing nothing. All right, what is disguised unemployment? Well, disguised unemployment is when we hire too many people to do too little work. Now, what does that mean? Well, in India, families are pretty much running the arable land. So you'll have a significant amount of land. Next, let's talk about disguised unemployment. So, what is disguised unemployment? Disguised unemployment is a situation in which too many people are doing too little work. So, what does that mean? Let me give you a simple example. Let's say we want to clean the classroom. We only need 2 or 3 people at most to clean the classroom. But if we hire 7 people to clean the classroom, you can clearly imagine that a couple of people will be doing nothing to contribute to the output. Or in fact, they'll just be standing around or doing very little, or everybody will be doing less than what they should be doing. Those extra people would be better suited to doing other work. And that phenomenon is referred to as disguised unemployment. So in India, land holdings are usually operated by families, and families have a few too many children to harvest the land. So what they do is all of those people work on the farm. So what happens is all of those people work on the family farm, and as a result, work levels are not optimized. Next, let's move on to the dependence on rainfall. So, any reasonable society that's dependent on agriculture has a means of irrigation. And in India, there are some areas which are irrigated, but the vast majority of the lands are not irrigated and not irrigated properly, that's for sure. So, India is heavily dependent on rainfall. Next, let's take a look at subsistence farming. So, what is this? Subsistence farming means that people work on the land just to be able to survive. They don't earn excess profit. So, unfortunately, in India, that's the case. The majority of the people work on the land just to be able to have enough food to eat. Now, traditional inputs. What is this? Well, as you know by watching the news or watching YouTube or any kind of video source, people use tractors and trailers and modern inputs, lots of machinery to be able to remove. Next, let's take a look at traditional inputs. India is highly dependent on traditional inputs, whereas the rest of the world uses advanced machinery to harvest the land. Now, advanced machinery will allow us to do more work in less time, which then means more profitability. But India is unfortunately unable to do so because they still heavily depend on traditional inputs. Moving on to small holdings, if we think about that traditional input area, what does it mean? Well, we're using maybe pitchforks or cattle or maybe even physical labor to work on the land. But in the United States or in other areas, you can see a tractor and it's plowing through a vast area of land. But in India, because the land holdings are small, even if farmers wanted to use tractors, their space is so limited, it would be inefficient or ineffective and maybe cost prohibitive for them to even consider buying a tractor to plow through that land. That's why the land holdings are not maximized. Next, let's talk about the landlord tenant conflict. Well, in India, many of the landowners are not the people who are operating the lands themselves. So they'll rent out the land to some tillers, and the tillers will work on the land, and then they're charged rent for that land. But unfortunately for them, the rent levels are so high that they're left with little disposable income, probably none. And that's why they live on subsistence incomes, and the landowners are actually not doing any of the work. And there's a conflict between these two groups because the landowner wants to make as much profit as possible, whereas the tiller is also trying to earn as much income as possible, but because he has limited resources, lack of education, there are no options and no other alternatives for them. So this struggle is actually something where the tiller has no power in. And as a result, unfortunately, they have to be forced with living in subsistence levels of survival. And unfortunately, that's why their income is at a subsistence level. Next, let's talk about backward technology. Well, technology usually implies that we use means or methods which are new and allow us to maximize our efficiency. However, India is not able to rely on heavy duty equipment, and as a result, the output is suffering from it because lots of the labor is physically intensive. And as a result of that, they're not able to produce at international standards. So, what have we seen here? If we look at a summary of the features, we notice that by all accounts, the Indian system is dismal at best. Output levels are far lower than they should be. Advancement is limited. There's no irrigation or limited irrigation. And the society itself is not set up in a way such that the farmer is able to maximize their land holdings. All right, that leads us into the next topic, problems of agriculture, which you'll see is very, very similar to this topic.